A Trip into the Darkness. Chapter 8. That's very observant of you, dear Mallory, Troy whispered in her ear, nuzzling the side of her face and neck. His skin touching hers was distracting and made it nearly impossible to focus on her chaotic thoughts. She could feel his aura continuing to soak into her, and it was filling her with lust and need. She had always known deep down that she had somehow stolen others' energy, but she had never been aware of it like she was until now. The ache in between her legs had started back up, and she couldn't help the slight moan she heard escaping her lips. Troy took this as a sign to continue his advances. Dragging his tongue down her neck to her chest, she shivered, wanting him to touch her more. Luckily, her shirt was still mostly buttoned, so he couldn't reach her breasts, or else she might have come undone. "Tell me what you want," he commanded, pausing from the licking. Panting, Mallory replied, "I want you to get the fuck off me and let me go." She heard him grunt before he bit one of her nipples through the shirt. Crying out, she arched off the bed and thrashed against him. She could feel him trying to suckle her through the material, and the action was causing knots in her tummy. Releasing her hands, Troy sat up on his knees and then reached down to rip open her shirt. She heard buttons scattering around the room. They rolled in every direction, and a couple of them made a whacking sound as they slammed into the walls. Two of them she heard hit the metal door, making a ding before falling over and landing on the tile. In the few seconds it took her to process what had happened, Troy was already back on her. He scooped up her wrists and one hand above her head, and his other grabbed one of her breasts, and he licked and nibbled all over her chest. "Please," Mallory yelled as she continued to pant and wiggle underneath him. Moisture seeped from her and between her legs. Her head was spinning, and she felt high from lust. "Please what, Mallory?" he asked her in a throaty voice. "Stop." It was hard denying what her body craved, but she would not go through this willingly, no matter how good it felt. She had things she needed to remember, things he had stolen from her. Her brother and her master's degree. With those thoughts, tears began streaming down her cheeks, even as her sex drive continued to rage. Troy must have sensed the shift in her body because he stopped his sexual advances and sat up from her. She could feel him staring at her face, and she closed her eyes, turning her head away. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be here, and she didn't want to be different. She just wanted to go for a run around campus and pretend like none of this had happened. She pictured herself running, the air blowing on her face and her arms pumping beside her body and her feet beating against the asphalt. She felt a small kiss on the tip of her nose, and then his weight disappeared entirely. Shooting up to a sitting position, she grabbed her ripped shirt and pulled it closed in front of her. Looking at the door, she found him standing there, watching her from afar. "You have served me well for the night, pet. I have brought you a change of clothes and a couple other products." He nodded towards a small pile of stuff sitting beside the bathtub that she hadn't noticed until now. "I will have someone bring you your food here shortly, but until then, I would suggest you bathe and change." Troy's eyes roamed over her before he turned and used the thumb scanner to leave. Mallory jumped to her feet and ran to the door. The few seconds it took her to get there was enough for the door to fully shut and the latch to click into place. "Bastard!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Once again, she was back to pounding on the metal door, yelling profanity. She was able to go much longer this time without tiring. After what seemed like hours, Mallory finally lowered her aching fists. She was panting and angry, and she felt more alive than ever before. Her movements were fast and unnatural. Glancing down at her hands, she noticed her nails were longer and curved into sharp little tips. She placed her hand on the door and dragged her nails down it. It created a high-pitched screeching sound that hurt her ears. It also left marks on the metal door. "Huh, that's odd," she thought as she continued to stare at her hands. "What a strange development." With a sigh, she turned back towards the room. Looking at the messed-up bed, she could see small fibers sticking out of the bedding. Glancing at the floor, she could see the ridges in between the tiles. The buzzing that she had noticed earlier was also still there. She looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Peeking up at the lights, she found the slightest flicker and was almost certain that the sound was emitting from the ceiling. Perhaps something to do with the electricity? Looking down at her shirt, she found it was ruined thanks to that psycho, abusive asshole. There are only 6 buttons out of the 25 that hadn't been ripped off. The side of her body where he had bitten her was also stained red with blood. That made her heart drop. She kept forgetting about the blood-drinking thing, or maybe she was trying her hardest not to think about it. As a literate major, she was an avid reader. She was also open to anything documented in history. People needed inspiration from somewhere, after all, and it was no coincidence that people all over the world wrote about similar topics, especially older literature, before the time of computers or globalization. When someone would say they thought they saw a werewolf on a full moon, she would agree with them. Or if someone swore there was a ghost in their home, she would tell them that ghosts were more than likely real. Her mother had told her children that all myths are true, even if they aren't exactly what they seem. It sounded stupid at the time, but now look at her. A living, breathing myth. Standing there, Mallory felt dirty and tainted. As much as she would have loved to avoid his advice about bathing, that was exactly what she was about to do. Besides, she needed to wash his scent off her body. As she slowly walked to the other side of the room, she noticed she no longer felt like she was starving or dying of dehydration. The side of her neck was a little tender, but the ache was already starting to fade. At the tub, she bent down and turned on the hot water before pulling the lever so the shower would work. Stepping back, she remembered him telling her that he had given her immortality. She hoped he was lying. What a sad life she'd be damned to live if that statement was true. The world was already a terrible place, and to be stuck in it for longer than one lifetime seemed like a certain kind of punishment. That would also mean she would outlive her brother. She had hoped to be at his wedding someday, and for him to have kids. That way they could call her the cool aunt. She could see him now, yelling at her not to teach his children bad habits, as she set a glass of wine down on his $1,000 coffee table without a coaster. She looked at the pile of stuff Troy had left her. Dropping to her knees, she found a bottle of shampoo and conditioner, along with a bottle of mousse. Apparently, he expected her to style her hair while she was locked away in here. Mallory wanted to snort at that until she realized that all 3 products were the same brands as the ones she had at her apartment. This motherfucker, she thought as she clutched the bottles to her chest. She could just see his arrogant ass walking into her apartment like he owned the place, then ransacking her home. She hoped that he had tripped over one of her many sneakers while snooping around her house. She then thought of Ed, and a spike of fear went through her chest. Surely that monster wouldn't have hurt her neighbor. She knew if Ed had seen him trying to walk in or out of her apartment without her, he would have stopped him and asked what was going on. Ed would have also called Mallory to let her know some guy was creeping around. "He's fine, Mal. He didn't hurt him," she told herself, even though she didn't know if that statement was true, but she was going to believe it for now. If she thought about all the what-ifs, she would surely lose her sanity. With a sigh, she looked at the other items he had left her. A pair of black yoga pants, a soft red long-sleeved shirt, a pair of red underwear, and a matching bra. "This perv sure has a thing for red, doesn't he?" she thought as she threw the bra against the far wall. She would not need that. The bastard would have to torture her before she would agree to wear one of those. She also found a pair of fluffy red socks hiding under the pants. Standing up, she made her way to the steaming water. It entered her mind that he would most likely be recording her while she showered. Shaking her head, she mumbled, "What a demented pervert," and undressed from her old work clothes. Stepping under the hot, steaming water felt amazing. Looking down at the drain, she saw blood mixed with the water. Mallory felt discomfort as her mouth started to ache, and the daggers that were her teeth lengthened. Her nails also lengthened into sharp little claws as bloodlust stirred inside of her. Closing her eyes, she tried to block everything out and focus on her breathing. She had started meditating regularly when she was in her teens to help manage her stress. Teaching herself how to simply close her eyes and let everything else in the world disappear for a while was a medicine for her crazy life. Mallory had never had any real friends in her life. Her mother had moved them around so much growing up that maintaining any real friendships was impossible. This lifestyle was part of the reason she became so obsessed with reading. It was a way to escape reality. Nothing else mattered if you were living in a book. Then, when she started college and began working full-time, she felt like everything was spinning out of control. She had craved her mother's attention so badly that in between the stress of everything, she felt like she was drowning in grief. Not even meditating or reading was able to calm her during those times. That's when she decided to take up running. While running, she didn't have time for intrusive and negative thoughts because she was so focused on going faster and not allowing herself to stop. When she would get home from her runs, she would usually be so tired that she was able to relax without feeling complete despair. It became her drug. Well, that and the occasional use of alcohol. When the throbbing in her mouth went away, Mallory began soaping her hair and body. She loved this soap. It was made with real essential oils and smelled wonderful. Rosemary and tea tree oil are also both good for stimulating hair growth. Her conditioner was the same. At least the psychopath had provided her with this small comfort. After continuing to stand under the water for a while, she realized she was hungry. Not hungry like she had experienced when she first woke up after Troy had changed her, but hunger in a normal human way. The psychopath had said something about someone delivering her food. Perhaps she could try and ambush them and escape when they opened the door to deliver her meal. A ping of excitement shot through her as she shut off the water and found a towel to dry off with. Quickly pulling on her clothes, she scrunched some mousse into her hair, towel-dried it, and then went to stand close to the door and wait. Eventually, a sound on the other side of the door alerted Mallory that someone was out there. Bracing herself, she prepared to pounce. She could feel her teeth lengthening and her claws sharpening with the thought of another living creature being so close. A second later, a styrofoam tray was pushed in through a gap at the bottom of the metal door. Before she could process that the door had a smaller opening at the bottom, it closed again. "What the hell?" Mallory mumbled, dropping to her knees to look for the outline of the secret hole that had been used to deliver her food. She could just make out the indentions of an opening. Tracing her fingers along the indentions, she shook her head. It wasn't very large, just big enough to deliver meager amounts of food through. "Isn't that just grand?" she thought as she continued to stare at the bottom of the door and think about how escaping this concrete box just became that much more difficult. Looking down at the tray, she found a piece of chicken breast, some green beans, and a roll. There was also a bottle of water with her food and plastic silverware. Sitting down on her butt and putting her back against the door, she dragged the food to her. As she started eating, she felt impressed with how flavorful everything was. It was like she could taste every individual spice and ingredients used in it. It occurred to her that it might be a bad idea to eat the food, but she didn't really want to starve to death. She might change her mind if she was locked in this room too long, but for now she was hungry and didn't care. After she finished everything on her tray, she drained her bottle of water. Continuing to sit on the floor, she thought about how messed up her life had become in such a short amount of time. She wondered what her co-workers thought about her random disappearance. It was completely unlike her to run out of work and then not show up the next day. She hit her head a couple of times on the door behind her and asked herself how this had all happened. She tried to think about how long it had been since she had been taken. At this point, she had no clue. For all she knew, she could have been in here for a solid week. Perhaps she had only been in here for an hour. Wait, why would she think that? It made no sense because she knew it was much longer than that. A yawn tore through Mallory, and she realized her eyes were so heavy. She could barely keep them open. It was a struggle to stand up from the floor, and once she did, she felt like falling over. Putting a hand against the door to steady herself, she noticed the room had a slight spin to it. What the hell? Was this another side effect of the change? No, surely not, she thought as she tried to stumble to the bed. As her knees hit the bed frame, she fell onto the mattress. She tried to keep her eyes open, but everything was blurry. Mallory yawned again before giving into the pool, dragging her under.